Welcome to the fourth lecture, I believe, for the As Above, So Below Rising Tide Symposium. And today we're going to have Sam Labrier presenting on Vernadsky's Revolution in Life Science and Directionality of the Universe. Before we go into that, I wanted to say a few words on some of the developments that have been occurring in the world right now, because I think that they're quite striking against each other, which is the present crisis in Texas right now, which I'm sure most of you have heard, where they have an especially cold winter right now. And with the green energy forms that they have put in place, despite them being the oil capital in the United States, they are completely reliant on these green energy sources. Their economy has basically kind of broken down for the people, and the people don't have access to basic heating or even access to water at this point. Not only that, but they don't have any kind of emergency protocol response to the situation, which has been going on for a while now. And there isn't even, an emergency response from the country, which, I find very strange. I think that really showcases not only the priorities of the country in terms of putting these things in place, which are very predictable because they're weather sensitive, that you should always have some kind of backup plan. The fact that there isn't, and they're telling the people they have to deal with it, for the most part, there isn't really any kind of support. And we know some people living in Texas who've actually told us that their energy bills have gone up astronomically, something like $6,000 to $7,000, which is insane. So what kind of a future is that sort of setup supposed to offer to the people? And when, these things break down very predictably, or are unable to supply the energy needs very predictably, is it okay to let the people just basically deal with it? What are we exactly prioritizing? Who do we have in mind when we have these policies in place? I think this is incredibly striking because the UAE just recently successfully launched an orbiter 7 months ago that has entered into the Mars orbit February 9th, and they are the 5th country to have ever succeeded in doing this. China actually entered Mars orbit the day after, being the 6th country. Mars missions have about a 50%, actually above 50% fail rate. And the UAE is another oil-rich country, but they're aware that an oil economy is not the answer, but neither is green energy. The UAE is in the middle of a desert. Many of these Arab countries are in the middle of a desert. And so the idea of a shortage of water and also food is a real reality for these people. And so thinking in the future, because oil is not going to last forever, and also the oil market's very volatile anyway, what kind of an economy do you want to have set up so that you can have those needs met in a secure manner? And so the UAE decided to invest in a space program. And I don't mean invest in terms of money. I mean invest in terms of they have, as much of the Middle East, of mostly young people. And they have basically developed a science driver program so that young people, in order to inspire people, young people to enter into the science sectors, into the engineering sectors, they started the space program. And they even said it didn't matter if we were going to be successful in getting to Mars. They didn't really think that they were going to be successful. I mean, they tried their hardest and they succeeded, but it's a 50% fail rate. Even China, when they tried in 2011, failed. So This is an incredible victory, not just for the UAE, but actually for all of the Middle East, because the UAE has invited, I don't know if it's 11 Arab states, including UAE or not, but it's 11 Arab states that are now working, where they've been invited to have training at the UAE Space Center. And this is again with the idea that by countries doing a kind of focused, um, labor focused direction with a space program, you're going to have to solve things along the way, and you're going to develop your science and your engineering sectors off of that. So there's going to be many implications for coming up with problem-solving solutions to energy needs that will not be oil dependent. On top of that, the UAE has been working with South Korea to develop nuclear reactors. So this is incredibly striking when put to what is going on in Texas. And this really is the answer. The fact that the UAE has also offered this training. The Americans actually helped the UAE astronauts a lot with their space program, and now the UAE is opening their doors to 11 Arab states. This is sending a very strong message that really undercuts the geopolitics in these areas. And if they're able to develop sustainable, stable energy resources that are not oil dependent, it really does change the game in terms of like who you have to kind of acquiesce to nowadays if you're in the Middle East. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that it's really beautiful, and I think perfect timing for the West to kind of maybe open their eyes a little bit. And what better presenter than Sam Labrier, who actually has a background in nuclear engineering, electrical power engineering, and optical biophysics, to give us a lecture on Vernadsky and the directionality of the universe. So go ahead, Sam.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and that does tie in very nicely to the topic that I'm going to be presenting here today, which I'm calling humane development. I hope you can see it on your screen now. Is that all good? Can you guys see it now? The first slide?
Yes.
Okay. So the title is Humane Development Vernadsky and the Directionality of Progress. And just to give a bit of background, Matt contacted me a few months ago and said, we're doing a science symposium called As Above, So Below. Would you be interested in presenting something? And I immediately said yes, because As Above, So Below is one of my favorite concepts. It's something that I basically have it as one of my guiding principles whenever I'm problem solving, working through ideas. It's a very powerful concept, and it immediately set off a chain of ideas of things that I've wanted to develop more rigorously, but just haven't devoted any time to. So I want to start actually with a quote from John Winthrop, which might seem a bit strange, but I hope by the end it'll make sense why. I came across this quote in preparations for a class on the beginnings of the American system, and I think it's appropriate for the topic today. So he said in his Reasons for the Plantation of New England in 1628, "This land, England, grows weary of her inhabitants. So as man, who is the most precious of all creatures, is here more vile and base than the earth we tread upon. We use the authority of the law to hinder the increase of people. And thus it has come to pass that children, servants, and neighbors, especially if they be poor, are counted the greatest burden, which if things were right, it would be the chiefest earthly blessing. The whole earth is the Lord's garden, and he hath given it to the sons of men with a general condition. Genesis 1:28. Increase and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it, which was again renewed to Noah. The end is double, moral and natural, that man might enjoy the fruits of the earth, and God might have his due glory from the creature. So one of the questions I want to ask today is man the most precious of creatures, as John Winthrop says? And if so, why? So my first question would be, if it is true, is it true because it's in Genesis 1:28? Or is it in Genesis 1:28 because it is true? Very much goes back to ideas I developed in my last lecture of Leibniz. And the question Leibniz asked of whether something is good because God wills it, or whether God wills it because it is good. And I hope to answer this question by the end. I'm putting forward a hypothesis here in the spirit of Cusa's Deducta Ignorantia. He says, whatever is not truth cannot measure truth precisely. Hence, the intellect, which is not truth, never comprehends truth so precisely that truth cannot be comprehended infinitely more precisely. And in the spirit of Plato's seventh letter, where especially the part where he talks about why truth is never found in a written work, and in the Parmenides of Plato, where Parmenides asks Socrates, what is the higher hypothesis which unites all of the disparate hypotheses? So I'm not saying everything that I'm saying here is absolute verified truth. I'm saying I'm putting forward a hypothesis here in the spirit of Cusa and in the spirit of Plato's seventh letter and Parmenides. So question that I'd like to start with is, if the evolution of life on Earth and the evolution of the cosmos is not random, but rather directional, can we learn any lessons for the proper direction of the evolution of human civilization? So we'll begin now on the nature of living matter. So fractals are pretty well known. I won't spend too much time on them. Fractals are by definition as above, so below, especially self-similar fractals. As you zoom in on one part of it, that one part starts to look like the whole. The idea of fractals in nature was put forward by Benoit Mandelbrot in the early 1980s in his seminal textbook, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. He actually was developing these ideas before he put out this book. Here's a paper he wrote in the late 70s on the fractal geometry of trees. And we see this as above, so below fractal principle throughout the natural world. There's a lot of it already out there. It's quite a popular subject, so I won't spend too much time on it. If you're interested in it, there's a lot of stuff you can read and watch on it. But interestingly, perfect self-similar fractals don't actually exist much in nature. So you have fractal development in nature, but it's as if the perfect self-similar fractal is an ideal form, like Plato's form of the circle. The ideal circle doesn't exist anywhere in the real world. So too, a perfect self-similar fractal doesn't exist in nature. This is a synthetic fractal. It's generated, but you can see how much it resembles things like the leaves of ferns. Here too is another generated fractal, but you can see how much it resembles the development of a tree. In the cell walls of leaves, we can see fractal nature, where you can see the main stem, and off of the main stem you have a number of main stems branching off from it, and then a number of main stems branching off from those main stems in a sort of infinite pattern. This was one I found particularly pretty on a leaf in nature. So I won't go too much more into fractals, but we're going to see fractals come up later in the talk as a sort of uniting principle. So moving on now to the namesake of the presentation, Vladimir Vernadsky, from his work Some Words About the Noosphere, which he wrote towards the end of World War II in December 1943. And he wrote, the concept of the biosphere, i.e. the domain of life, was introduced in biology by Lamarck in Paris at the beginning of the 19th century, and in geology by Edward Suess in Vienna at the end of that century. In our century, there's an absolutely new understanding of the biosphere. And it's interesting, I'll take a brief break here just to quickly talk about Lamarck. It's interesting, he credits Lamarck as one of the creators of the concept of the biosphere, for which Vernadsky himself is really well known and associated. Nowadays, Lamarck is not given any credit for creating the concept of the biosphere, and Lamarck is basically erased from science, despite being one of the greatest scientists of his age, who made a number of fundamental improvements to science. Lamarck was the actual creator of the theory of evolution. He called it the transmutation of species in his book Philosophie zoologique in 1809. So that's 50 years before Darwin. And he posited a directional quality to evolution, something he called the complexifying force, which is where organisms move up what he called the ladder of progress, which is always ever increasing in complexity, only going in one direction. He also came up with the concept of the adaptive force, which is that organisms adapt to their environment and develop new features or discard old features as necessary. Sometimes Lamarck is ridiculed, and Lamarckism is ridiculed as being teleological, meaning the directionality, the reason for the directionality is sort of given in a sort of circular logic, that it is that way because it was intended to be that way. But Lamarck was a physical scientist, and he insisted that it was not teleological, but everything that he was saying was based on physical principles, which maybe he didn't understand them in his day, but they could be understood by the mind of man. And each year, Lamarck's ideas are becoming more and more vindicated with the advent of epigenetics. So epigenetics is the discovery that environment does cause mutations and can influence evolution outside of your genes, hence the term epigenetics. So each year scientists are sort of wondering more and more, was Lamarck right? Is there sort of interaction with the environment that's leading to evolutionary changes which can then be passed on to your children? And it's not a purely random scientific phenomenon as Darwin posited. So I think that's interesting of Vernadsky's mention of him. And I just wanted to go over Lamarck a little bit. Going back to Vernadsky in his 1943 work, he writes, it's emerging that the biosphere is emerging as a planetary phenomenon that is cosmic in nature. In biogeochemistry, we have to consider that life or living organisms really exist not on our planet alone, not only in the Earth's biosphere. The idea of life as a cosmic phenomenon has been found in the scientific archives, including our own, for a long time. Centuries ago, in the late 17th century, the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens, in his last work, Cosmotheoros, which was published posthumously, formulated this scientific question. The book was published in Russian twice in the first quarter of the 18th century on the initiative of Peter I. In this book, Huygens established the scientific generalization that life is a cosmic phenomenon, in some way sharply distinct from non-living matter. I recently named this generalization the Huygens principle. The younger contemporaries of Darwin, James Dwight Dana and Joseph LeConte, both great American geologists, and Dana, a mineralogist and biologist as well, expounded even prior to 1859 the empirical generalization that the evolution of living matter is proceeding in a definite direction. This phenomenon was called by Dana cephalization, and by Leconte the Psychozoic era. Dana, like Darwin, adopted this idea at the time of his journey around the world, which he started in 1838, 2 years after Darwin's return to London, and which lasted until 1842. The soundness of Dana's principle, which happens to be outside the horizon of our paleontologists, may easily be verified by anyone willing to do so on the basis of any modern treatise on paleontology. The principle not only embraces the whole animal kingdom, but likewise reveals itself clearly in individual types of animals. Dana pointed out that in the course of geological time, at least 2 billion years and probably much more, there occurs an irregular process of growth and perfection of the central nervous system, beginning with the crustacea whose study Dana used to establish his principle, the mollusks developing into cephalopods, and ending with man. This phenomenon he called cephalization. The brain, which has once achieved a certain level in the process of evolution, is not subject to retrogression, but can only progress further. Man, under our very eyes, is becoming a mighty and ever-growing geological force. This geological force was formed quite imperceptibly over a long period of time. A change in man's position on our planet, his material position first of all, coincided with it. In the 20th century, man, for the first time in the history of the Earth, knew and embraced the whole biosphere, completed the geographic map of the planet Earth, and colonized its whole surface. Mankind became a single totality in the life of the Earth. There is no spot on Earth where man cannot live if he so desires. Our people's sojourn on the floating ice of the North Pole in 1937-38 has proved this clearly. At the same time, owing to the mighty techniques and successes of scientific thought, radio and television, man is able to speak instantly to anyone he wishes at any point on our planet. Transportation by air has reached a speed of several hundred kilometers per hour and has not reached its maximum. All this is the result of cephalization, the growth of man's brain, and the work directed by his brain. The economist Lucio Brentano illuminated the planetary significance of this phenomenon with the following striking computation. If a square meter were assigned to each man, and if all men were put close to one another, they would not occupy the area of even the small Lake of Constance between the borders of Bavaria and Switzerland. The remainder of the Earth's surface would remain empty of man. Thus, the whole of mankind put together represents an insignificant mass of the planet's matter. Its strength is derived not from its matter, but from its brain. If man understands this and does not use his brain and his work for self-destruction, an immense future is open before him in the geological history of the biosphere. The geological evolutionary process shows the biological unity and equality of all men, Homo sapiens and his ancestors, Sinanthropus and others. Their progeny and mixed white, red, yellow, and black races evolve ceaselessly in innumerable generations. This is a law of nature. All the races are able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. In a historical contest, as for instance in a war of such magnitude as the present one, he finally wins who follows that law. I like that little dig at Hitler there. One cannot oppose with impunity the principle of the unity of all men as a law of nature. The noosphere is a new geological phenomenon on our planet. In it, for the first time, man becomes a large-scale geological force. He can and must rebuild the province of his life by his work and thought, rebuild it radically in comparison with the past. Wider and wider creative possibilities open before him. It may be that the generation of our grandchildren will approach their blossoming. As for the coming of the noosphere, we see around us at every step the empirical results of that incomprehensible process. That mineralogical rarity, native iron, is now being produced by the billions of tons. Native aluminum, which never before existed on our planet, is now produced in any quantity. The same is true with regard to the countless number of artificial chemical combinations newly created on our planet. The number of such artificial minerals is constantly increasing. All the strategic raw materials belong here. Chemically, the face of our planet, the biosphere, is being sharply changed by man. So the first thing I want to point out is what Vernadsky called the soundness of Dana's principle of cephalization is a highly controversial thought today in science that immediately opens you up to ridicule from almost everyone in science. And that is to a large extent due to Darwin and all the people around Darwin. So Darwin ended directionality in terms of the evolution of life with his Origin of the Species, where he attributes everything to random and unknowable phenomena that are we just must accept. Very similar to quantum physics today, that things are just the result of random processes we can never understand. And I think it's important to note that it was actually Malthus who gave us Darwin. This is from Darwin himself in his diary, an entry from October 1838. He said, "I happened to read for amusement Malthus's On Population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. Here then I at least got a theory by which to work." So thank you, Malthus, for giving us the scientific rot of Darwin's random natural selection. Briefly, I'll just talk about social Darwinism. It's sometimes said to have come after Darwin and sort of an unfortunate consequence of Darwin. But if you study the history of Darwinism, the people that were around him and Darwin's own words, it's very clear that this is not the case at all. First of all, Malthus and social Darwinism are highly similar. And we know that Darwin's ideas came from Malthus. And this is from Charles Darwin himself in Descent of Man. "In the last and present chapters, I've considered the advancement of man from a former semi-human condition to his present state as a barbarian. But some remarks on the agency of natural selection on civilized nations may be here worth adding. This subject has been ably discussed by Mr. W.R. Gregg and previously by Mr. Wallace and Mr. Galton. Most of my remarks are taken from these three authors." So Mr. Galton, he's referring to the father of eugenics, the man who created eugenics, who is also, by the way, Darwin's cousin. And so this idea that Darwin had nothing to do with social Darwinism, this is what he says in The Descent of Man. "With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man." So agape, science, innovations in taking care of people, this is highly injurious to humanity. "It's surprising how soon a want of care or care wrongly directed leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." And what are the worst animals of mankind? "The aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered in the manner previously indicated more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy, if so urged, by hard reason, without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature. The surgeon may harden himself whilst performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit with a certain and great present evil. Hence, we must bear without complaining the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. but there appears to be at least one check in steady action, namely the weaker and inferior members of society not marrying so freely as the sound. And this check might be indefinitely increased, though this is more to be hoped for than expected, by the weak in body or mind refraining from marriage. So, what kind of human society would Darwin's outlook create? If we have one where value in humanity is only comes from people having a strong constitution, people not being feeble-minded, people not being disabled. There's no concept whatsoever that the value of a human comes from the human mind. And so Darwin's outlook on society, for example, the numerous gifts given to humanity from somebody like Helen Keller would not exist, because they simply couldn't exist, because Darwin doesn't even have a concept for how these people could in any way be beneficial to society. Now, moving on to Thomas Huxley, who is sometimes known as Darwin's bulldog, because he is really more than anyone responsible for getting rid of directionality in life sciences and in evolution, and in the bestialization of man. In other words, man is no different from any other animal. So this is a letter from Thomas Huxley to his closest friend and collaborator, Joseph Dalton Hooker, September 5th, 1858. He says, Wallace's impetus seems to have set Darwin going in earnest. Wallace and Darwin competed in developing the theory of evolution. Wallace had a bit more of a Christian concept and more directionality than Darwin's completely random process. It set Darwin going in earnest, and I'm rejoiced to hear we shall learn his views in full at last. I look forward to a great revolution being effected. Depend on it in natural history and everything else. When the English mind fully determines to work a thing out, it will do it better than any other. I firmly believe in the advent of an English epoch in science and art, which will lick the Augustan into fits. And here he's referring to the Augustan age in England, which was an age characterized by poets like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, and a much more humanist bent in their society's culture, which Huxley despised and wanted to get rid of. His son, Leonard Huxley, wrote in The Life and Letters of Thomas Huxley, he said his father told him that Plato was the founder of all the vague and unsound thinking that has burdened philosophy, deserting facts for possibilities, and then, after long and beautiful stories of what might be, telling you he doesn't quite believe them himself. It's a pretty striking characterization of somebody like Plato, who dedicated his life to philosophy, in part at least, of how can you tell if something is true? How do you know? How can you evaluate truth? To say that, this unsound thinking has burdened philosophy. And he goes on to say that his father said the movement of modern philosophy is back to the position of the old Ionian philosophers, but strengthened and clarified by sound scientific ideas. The thread of philosophical development is not the lines usually laid down for it. It goes from Democritus and the rest to the Epicureans and then to the Stoics, who tried to reconcile it with popular theological ideas. So the true philosophy is, sense certainty and the empiricism of people like Democritus and Epicureans. So Thomas Huxley, in his 1863 book, Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature, this is a crucial book. This book, more than any other book, is responsible for removing man as a higher class of animals in science and establishing man as no different from any of the other great apes. And it's a scientific philosophy that has persisted to this day. This is from the inside. This is a famous graphic from the book where he's attempting to show how man is no different from the other great apes. What was called back then the quadrumana. The quadrumana are the great apes. Quad meaning that they walk. They use all four of their limbs for walking, and man being classified as bimana, as he walks upright only on both legs, and he uses his arms in the service of his brain. This is, again, a concept that we'll see from cephalization. So you can see just from this graph, from this image, I mean, huge differences between the apes and man, even from Huxley's own work. But Huxley goes on to say, all animals are derived from eggs, ovum. And the dog, like all animals, save the very lowest, commences its existence as an egg, as a body which is in every sense as much an egg as that of a hen, but is devoid of that accumulation of nutritive matter which confers upon the bird's egg its exceptional size and domestic utility. The history of the development of any other vertebrate animal, lizard, snake, frog, or fish, tells the same story. There's always, to begin with, an egg having the same essential structure as that of the dog. Furthermore, there is a period in which the young of all these animals resemble one another, not merely in outward form, but in all essentials of structure, so closely that the differences between them are inconsiderable, while in their subsequent course, they diverge more and more widely from one another. And it is a general law that the more closely any animals resemble one another in adult structure, the longer and the more intimately do their embryos resemble one another. So that, for example, the embryos of a snake and of a lizard remain like one another longer than do those of a snake and of a bird. And the embryo of a dog and a cat remain like one another for a far longer period than do those of a dog and a bird. Thus, the study of development affords a clear test of closeness of structural affinity, and one turns with impatience to inquire what results are yielded by the study of the development of man. Is he something apart? Does he originate in a totally different way from dog, bird, frog, and fish, thus justifying those who assert him to have no place in nature and no real affinity with the lower world of animal life? Or does he originate in a similar germ, pass through the same slow and gradually progressive modifications, depend on the same contrivances for protection and nutrition, and finally enter the world by the help of the same mechanism? The reply is not doubtful for a moment. Without question, the mode of origin and the early stages of the development of man are identical with those of the animals immediately below him in the scale. Without a doubt, in these respects, he is far nearer the apes than the apes are to the dog. So, I mean, this is sophistry on a level I can't even fathom. Like, because the development of the eggs is similar and of the embryos, that therefore that means man is just like all the other animals. Like, if you believe that, I can't help you. So Prime Minister William Gladstone, he was a creationist, and he attacked Huxley and Darwin publicly. And this is what Thomas Huxley had to say. He said, "It has always astonished me how a man after 50 or 60 years of life," meaning Gladstone, "among men could be so ignorant of the best way to handle his materials. If he had only read Dana, he would have found his case much better stated." So Dana, as previously mentioned, the originator of the concept of cephalization. I think this is a good point to start examining the life of James Dwight Dana a little bit more. So who was James Dwight Dana? Who was his family? So he actually comes from a very famous family, the Dana family. And the patriarch of the Dana family in America, Richard Dana, arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to the Massachusetts Bay Colony of John Winthrop in 1640. Richard Dana had 14 children, including Daniel Dana. Daniel Dana was the great-great-grandfather of James Dwight Dana, and he was the father of Richard Dana. Richard Dana, born 1700, was a member of the Sons of Liberty. He led Massachusetts' opposition to the Stamp Act of 1765. He was an attorney who worked for the city of Boston to investigate the Boston Massacre. And he was the father of Francis Dana. Francis Dana, born 1743, was a member of the Sons of Liberty. He was elected to the Continental Congress in 1774, 1777, and 1784. He was one of the signers of the Articles of Confederation in 1778. He was the chairman of the committee to confer with Washington at Valley Forge, and he met with Washington there. He vigorously opposed reconciliation with Britain during the Revolutionary War. He accompanied John Adams to Paris in 1778. He was a diplomat who was named American Minister to Russia in 1780 to 1783. He was nominated to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in 1785 and was made Chief Justice in 1791. He was a Federalist with Alexander Hamilton and a strong advocate for the Constitution. And he was a member of the Massachusetts Ratification Convention in 1788. So he fought for the ratification of the Constitution in Massachusetts. So we see Dana, his family, very much a part of these patriotic nationalist circles that we talk about often of George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. I brought in that John Winthrop quote earlier because my next class is going to be on the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as I've come to appreciate how important it was. And so when I saw his family came from Massachusetts primarily, it was a big red flag for me, and I started digging in and finding some of this stuff about what family he comes from. So some of his other influences, direct influences, this man, Benjamin Silliman, who's one of the greatest American scientists in history. He is one of the founders of science at Yale University. He founded the American Journal of Science, which is to this day the oldest continuously operating American scientific journal. He was vehemently anti-slavery, called it an enormous evil. He kicked off the American oil industry with the discovery of fractional distillation in 1855. So, huge consequences to his work there. And he was also the father-in-law to James Dwight Dana. So James Dwight Dana married his daughter, and also the father-in-law to Daniel Coit Gilman, who also married one of his daughters. And Daniel Coit Gilman, we'll see later, he wrote a very well-known biography of Dana. And Dana was a student of Silliman originally. And I may slip up and accidentally call him Silly Man because I've been trying not to, but it sometimes happens. It's an unfortunate last name. And this other man was another great influence on Dana, Amos Eaton. He was also a student of Benjamin Silliman. And he was a co-founder of the Rensselaer School in Troy, New York, which is now known as Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's the oldest technological university in the English-speaking world in New York. He encouraged women to participate in science. He believed there was no difference between men and women in terms of their ability to understand and work in science, and that it was really a lack of opportunity for women more than anything. In 1818, he returned to Albany to work on surveying and geological work in the planning for the Erie Canal with DeWitt Clinton, who was the patriotic governor of New York, who fought for a long time to get the Erie Canal built. Some of you who have read Anton Chaikin's new book may be aware of that. He goes on quite a bit about the Erie Canal and DeWitt Clinton. He also dedicated his life to developing systematic scientific works in English, not in Latin, very Dante-esque in terms of writing in the vernacular of the people, not in a unapproachable dead language like Latin that the vast majority of people cannot read. So these were the background on Dana. This is where he comes from. And this is a letter that he wrote to Arnold Guyot, who himself was a famous American scientist, in 1863. He wrote to Guyot saying, "Am I right in saying that you have first brought forward the idea that the human race would necessarily have sunk to a state of degradation as the first stage after creation on account of man's primal ignorance, together with his natural selfishness and vicious properties? Please drop me a line by return mail, as I have an allusion to the subject in a brief notice of Huxley in the journal Science. When shall we have for the journal your first article on classification? The debasing association of man with the quadrumana, which Huxley is fighting for, which so many zoologists are now admitting, calls for immediate action on the part of those who know what is truth, and I want very much to have you speak out. The interests of science at large require your thoughts." So I was unable to find Guyot's reply to Dana, but here we have another letter that same year, later that year, So we can sort of infer what happened. James Dwight Dana says, I was very glad to hear once more from you, but sorry to learn that impaired health had kept you silent. So likely his health was suffering and he wasn't able to mount that counterattack on the idea of man just being another one of the great apes, or quadrumana as they called it back then. I have 37 pages in type of my own in the next number of the journal, the Journal of Science of Silliman. Pages that have cost me a vast deal of thought, but I could not help it. My head would think and work over the developing ideas, and I saw rest ahead only in giving it play until the mouse was brought forth. The subject is classification of animals as based on cephalization. I was afraid that you would think me encroaching on a topic we had worked on together. But this cephalization kept working out new and unexpected results, and I thought my true course was to publish them in detail, and then you would have them to adjust into your more ideal system. The whole of the article has been evolved since summer began, except what appears in my former articles. I will send you a copy as soon as it is all struck off. I lay out at length the general laws bearing on classification, with full explanations, and then give the classes, orders, and some of the tribes of the animal kingdom, as they appear to be in nature, in the light of the principle illustrated. So this is the article in question. You can see part 2, the classification of animals based on the principle of cephalization. This is published in the journal 1863. In it, he says, as the principle of cephalization is involved in the very foundation of the diverse forms that make up the animal kingdom, we may look to it for authoritative guidance with reference to the system that prevails among those forms. Some of its bearings on zoological classification have already been pointed out. I propose to take up the subject more comprehensively, and in the present article to bring the light of the principle to bear on the relations of the subkingdoms, classes, orders, and some of the tribes of animal life. It is essential first that the methods or laws of cephalization be systematically set forth, that they may be conveniently studied and compared. The following statement of them is an extension of what has already been presented. As an animal is a cephalized organism, or one terminating anteriorly in a head, the anterior and posterior extremities have opposite relations. The subdivision of the structure into anterior and posterior portions has therefore a special importance in this connection. As these terms are used beyond, the anterior portion properly includes the head, which is the seat of the senses and mouth, with whatever organs are tributary to its purposes, anterior in position to the normal locomotive organs. The posterior portion is the rest of the structure. The anterior is eminently the cephalic portion. The digestive viscera from the stomach backward and the reproductive viscera belong as characteristically to the posterior portion. It follows further from the cephalized nature of an animal that its primary center of force, or the point from which concentration and the reverse are to be measured, anteriorly and posteriorly, is in the head, near the anterior extremity of the structure. The higher subdivisions of the class of mammals are 4 in number, starting from man and descending to the megasthenes, the microsthenes, and the otocoids. I've tried to find what these old terms mean. I couldn't find them. I'm sorry. Man is shown to stand apart from the megasthenes on precisely the same characteristic that separates the 2 highest orders under the classes severally of insectians and crustaceans. For in passing from man to the brute mammals, there is a transfer of the forelimbs from the cephalic to the locomotive series. Moreover, a study of the vertebrate skeleton has shown that the forelimbs in the vertebrate type are cephalic appendages, being normally appendages to the posterior or occipital division of the head. In the fish, these forelimbs, the pectoral fins, have at any rate an actual cephalic position, back of which position they are thrown by displacement in other vertebrates. Now in man, they are not only cephalic in normal structural relations, but cephalic also in use. The transfer of these cephalic organs to the locomotive series, by which the brute structure is made, is a manifest degradation of the type. Man is thus the only vertebrate in which the vertebrate type is expressed in its perfection, and therefore occupies alone the sublime summit of the system of life. And here we can see some excerpts from his article where he shows divisions of the different classes of animals. So he puts mammals at the top of the vertebrates, and then descending from the vertebrates down to articulates, mollusks, and radiates. And then inside mammals, he classifies man as the highest, going down to the megasthenes, the microsthenes, and the octoids, which here he does elaborate on what these terms mean. So microsthenes includes herbivores, rodents, and microsthenic. I don't know what that means, but we do get a bit more of a clue of what these terms means. But he's clearly showing man at a summit here as separate from what they used to call the quadrumans, or the other great apes who walk on all fours. So as I said earlier, his brother-in-law, Daniel Coit Gilman, wrote a well-known biography of him called The Life of James Dwight Dana. And from this book, we get the following quote. He says, Professor Joseph Leconte, who we saw mentioned by Vernadsky earlier, of the University of California, spoke as follows before the American Society of Geologists soon after Mr. Dana's death. This address is so admirable in style and so appreciative in spirit that its principal paragraphs will be given to the reader. So this is from Joseph Leconte and his address. Dana's wide and exact knowledge in many departments fitted him in a peculiar way and in an eminent degree for the highest achievements in geology. No mere specialist in geology could have done Dana's work. And he goes on to list three of the main topics which he found most profound that Dana elaborated. And he says the second line, the other two have to do with geology, so I've left them out. He says the second line of thought suggested by the observations of his famous voyage, but which he continued to follow up during his whole life, was the idea of cephalization, or headward development. That is, the increasing dominance of head functions over other functions, and therefore the increasing subordination of the whole structure of the animal body to the service of the head as we go up the scale in any class. Dana announced this as a law of structural elevation in any class, or as we would say now, as a law of evolution, and therefore as a guide to classification. He came upon this law in studying the modifications of the limbs of crustaceans. He found that as we rise in the scale, more and more of the appendages are released from the function of locomotion to be devoted to the service of the head. He afterwards applied it to other classes of animals. Like all great thoughts, its fertility is inexhaustible and its application boundless. It might be generalized as a gradually increasing dominance of the higher over the lower and of the highest over all. In this form, the law is universal. To give one illustration of my own, in passing from the lowest protozoan to man, among the many systems of organs which are successively differentiated, there is an increasing dominance of the highest system, namely the nervous system. Then in the nervous system, an increasing dominance of the highest part, that is, the brain. In the brain, an increasing dominance of the highest ganglion, the cerebrum. In the cerebrum of the highest part, namely the external gray matter, as shown by the number and depth of convolutions. Then among the convolutions, an increasing proportion in the highest lobe of the cerebrum, the frontal lobe, as marked off by the fissure of Rollin. I need hardly say that the same law prevails also in the evolution of the individual, both physical and psychical. As there is an increasing dominance of mind over body, so in the mind there is an increasing dominance of reflective over the perceptive faculties, and finally of the moral faculties overall. The same is true of social evolution. In all and everywhere we find the same law of cephalization. Everywhere, in physical, psychical, and social evolution, in education, in intellectual and moral culture, and in civilization, we find an increasing dominance of the higher over the lower and of the highest over all. I do not follow up this thought only because I do not know that Dana himself did so. In a singular degree, he united boldness of thought with extreme cautiousness in method. And so I'll end this section going back to his 1863 on this classification of animals based on cephalization. He says, the laws of cephalization, as is apparent from the explanations which have been made, are based upon the idea that an animal is centralized force, and that the degree of concentration of this force may be exhibited in the structure. That consequently, the various grades of species or groups become apparent to some extent through size and form, and their determination is thus, in part, a matter of simple measurement. Dimensions or spatial conditions have a relation to force in the animal kingdom as well as in that of the celestial spheres. So now moving on to the domain of the celestial spheres, we can move on to the nature of the universe. And the first thing I wanted to bring up is going back to the ideas of fractals and the idea of a fractal universe. And to give an illustration of what I mean, in this picture here, what are you looking at? Are you looking at stars? Are you looking at galaxies? There's no way to know, right? As you zoom out, the universe itself becomes self-similar. To illustrate another example, I'll just stop here for a sec. You guys can see this webpage?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. So just going here to a scale of 5 parsecs. And here you can see yellow meaning stars. Okay. So we're on a scale here with this orange dot in the middle signifies the sun. So this whole thing is done, and you can move it around as you can see, but this whole thing is done from the putting the sun at the center. But as we move out to the biggest scale of 50 megaparsecs, you see it basically looks the same, except now all of these are galaxies, not stars. But so this is sort of an illustration of what's meant by the fractal nature of the universe. So I'll move back now. This is full screen again. So the fractal universe is not my concept. It's not a new concept. Actually, Benoit Mandelbrot in his book where he talked about it in Nature actually has a whole chapter on applying fractal theory to galaxies. And he asks, is there an upper cutoff to the scaling range as we zoom out? There's a number of articles that have come out hinting or examining the concept of the fractal universe. This man here, Paul Coleman, is a particularly well-known advocate of the fractal universe theory. Here we see an article from the Institute of Astronomy in St. Petersburg, a fractal approach to large-scale galaxy distribution, and why fractality is important in cosmology, the impacts of fractal theory. We also see emerging theories about even fractal geometry in the very small. So as above, so below, again, in fractal geometry taking place within the nucleus of the atom. This is an experiment from Scandinavia, where they, with an electron microscope, measured an arrangement of electrons which very closely resembles the Sierpinski triangle, which is a very famous example of a self-similar fractal. Some more, here we see some more examples of scientific papers asking about the fractal nature of the universe. And here I'll just quote briefly from this. This is a paper from Yale, so where Silliman and Dana taught as well. Galaxy Formation and Evolution by Richard B. Larson. He says, numerical simulations of the development of large-scale structure in the universe also produce complex filamentary structures with a fractal-like appearance. Recent analyses of the observed large-scale distribution of galaxies have shown that there are two regimes in which the distribution of matter is approximately self-similar and can be characterized by different fractal dimensions. On small scales, less than about 5 megaparsecs, the well-known Peebles covariance function implies a fractal dimension of d equals approximately 1.2, which reflects the approximately isothermal clustering of galaxies. Whereas on scales between about 5 and 50 megaparsecs, where the initial structure has not yet been greatly altered by gravitational clustering, a different scaling behavior is found that corresponds to a fractal dimension of approximately 2.2. A fractal dimension of 2.2 would be characteristic, for example, of an open filamentary or sponge-like structure, which indeed is a good description of the observed appearance of the universe on these scales. So now, next, after fractals, we talked about cephalization in nature. So obviously, we don't see cephalization in the universe in the same way that we do in living matter, because the universe is not made up of living matter. But the universe is evolving. So do we see a pattern in the evolution of the universe that is similar to the cephalization that we see in the evolution of life? So if we characterize it as energy and matter highly concentrated in one area, with appendages emanating from and serving the cephalized region, and we can clearly see in the development of spiral galaxies a clear example of cephalization, with energy mostly concentrated at the center and with appendages spiraling out from the center to the extremity. And lastly, I want to talk about the anti-entropic nature of the universe, because it's something that is, the degradation of science is largely due to this idea that the universe is entropic and winding down. And it's quite depressing if you believe in it, because it sort of gives you the sense of, what's the point of doing anything? The universe is just going to wind down eventually anyway, and there's no point to anything. But actually, defining entropy as a characteristic of moving to higher states of disorder or randomness, we see that the universe actually is anti-entropic in nature, that the universe began in a high state of disorder and randomness and has moved to clear patterns of development that are much more developed and much more regular patterns of order than in the initial conditions of the Big Bang that created the universe. And this also ties into the fraud of applying the theory of thermodynamics to the entire universe, which I know Matt and others have spoken about in the past. But the laws of thermodynamics were originally developed for closed systems like heat engines. And it's certainly true that in closed heat engines, entropy does increase over time. Like materials break down. You definitely do get disorder increasing over time in a closed heat engine. But is the universe a closed system? And where's the evidence for this? The definition of a thermodynamic system is: a thermodynamic system is a body of matter and or radiation confined in space by walls, like a heat engine is, with defined permeabilities which separates it from its surroundings. Does this sound like the universe? What is the nature of the walls that confine the universe in this supposed heat engine of the universe? And going back to the idea that the universe is fractal, we can sort of imagine that if we were able to zoom out far beyond the scale of our universe, we may see an abundance of universes, much like we see when we zoom out far enough an abundance of stars, or zooming out even further, an abundance of galaxies. And so it has implications for the very notions that are, very strongly kept to in science, that there's one universe and there's nothing else, and it's a closed system. For example, if you view it in this fractal nature, certain problems like the need for dark matter immediately goes away. Like the expansion in the universe that we can't explain, because we assume the universe is a closed system and isolated from anything else, immediately goes away if you assume a fractal nature where you can zoom out far beyond the universe and see other universes surrounding it. Then you have a ton of extra energy, rotational energy and otherwise, that's being fed into our universe that can explain extra expansion of the universe that can't be explained given current theories. So I won't develop it any further, but I feel like the fractal view of the universe is a highly useful viewpoint and ties in very nicely to the theme of as above, so below. So studying these two questions, what are the implications for human progress? So if we see man as the highest form of cephalization in nature, as far as we know, it has a quality that no other animal has. That quality is to increase its understanding of the universe in order to increase its chances of survival and its numbers. This is a graph of human population since 10,000 BC. And we see that mankind's population density has increased, 900 times or so. There's no other animal on Earth that could come even remotely close to doing this. Man is the only animal capable of making scientific discoveries and applying them to his way of life that allows for this increase in numbers outside of quote unquote resource constraints, natural resource constraints. So are there any examples of as above, so below in human society? And I want to talk a little bit about this concept of homo faber and deus faber in Henry Bergson's Creative Evolution from 1907. He elaborates on this concept that it's our creative reason which separates us from all other animals. Deus faber meaning God the creator, and homo faber meaning man the creator in the image of God. The process of cephalization necessarily leads to the increases in intelligence that we see in the higher species, and has culminated ultimately in humanity, at least as far as we know. This is very similar to a concept some of us know already, imago Dei, from the Golden Renaissance, of man in the image of God. And it's worth noting that many of the people who I've just mentioned, including Silliman and Dana and Bergson, were all devout Christians, scientists, but they were Christians who loved humanity and had this concept of man created in the image of God, as opposed to people like Thomas Huxley. So I'll go back to Vernadsky here. He writes this in The Evolution of Species and Living Matter in 1926. The appearance of the evolved Homo sapiens, who we can, it seems, name by combining the terminology of Linnaeus and that of Bergson in employing the threefold characteristic of the species Homo sapiens faber. The thought of Homo sapiens faber is a new fact which fundamentally changes the structure of the biosphere after myriad centuries. And he also writes in On Human Autotrophy in 1925. There now exists on the terrestrial surface a great geological force. This force does not seem to be a new manifestation or special form of energy, nor yet a pure and simple expression of known energy, but it exerts a profound and powerful influence on the course of energetic phenomena on the Earth's surface, and consequently has repercussions smaller but undeniable beyond the surface on the existence of the planet itself. This force is human reason, the directed and controlled will of social man. Over the last several centuries, human society has increasingly distinguished itself from merely living matter by society's action on the surrounding environment. This society becomes, in the biosphere, that is to say, in the outer envelope of our planet, a unique factor, growing powerfully with great acceleration, a factor which changes by itself in a new and rapidly growing manner the most fundamental mechanisms of the biosphere. It becomes more and more independent of other forms of life and evolves toward a new vital manifestation. Man is a heterotrophic social animal. He can only exist in the presence of other organisms, especially green plants. His existence on our planet is clearly distinguished all the same from that of all other organized beings. Reason, which distinguishes man within the assemblage of living matter, gives living matter remarkable characteristics, profoundly changing its action on the environment. The genesis of man was a singular event, unique in geological history, which had no analog in the preceding myriads of centuries. It's clear that there exists a determined direction in the paleontological evolution of organized beings, and that the appearance of understanding, of reason, of coordinated will on the terrestrial surface, this manifestation of man cannot be a game of chance. Man is profoundly distinguished from the other organisms by his action on the environment. This distinction, which was great from the beginning, has become immense with the passage of time. But his mass is completely negligible in comparison with the totality of living matter. It is clear that the manifestation of such a living mass considered on the scale of geological phenomena would be negligible. Reason changes all. Through it, man utilizes material in the environment, inanimate or living, not only for the building of his body, but also for social life. And this usage has become a great geological force. Thought, by its existence, introduces into the crustal mechanisms a powerful process having no analog before the appearance of man. Man is the Homo faber of M.H. Bergson. He changes this aspect, the chemical and mineralogical composition of his living environment. His living environment is the whole of the surface of the earth. His action becomes stronger and more coordinated with each passing century. The naturalist must acknowledge a natural process of the same order as all of the other geological manifestations. This process is necessarily regulated by the principle of inertia. It will follow its course regardless if forces don't exist which oppose it or which take it to a potential state. The discovery of agriculture made over 600 generations before us decided the path of humanity. By controlling the life of the autotrophic green organisms on the terrestrial surface, man gained leverage with immense consequences for the history of the planet. Man has become, by this fact, master of all living matter and not just green plants, since the existence of all beings is controlled by the green plants. Little by little, he changed living matter by the decisions, the goals of his reason. Through agriculture, he was liberated in his nutrition from the natural living environment, of which all the other organized beings are not in this respect, but impotent processes. Relying on this great conquest, man has annihilated virgin nature. He has introduced immense quantities of new, unknown chemical compounds and new forms of life, races of animals and plants. He has changed the course of all geochemical reactions. The face of the planet became new and found itself in a state of continual upheaval. But man has not yet succeeded in gaining, in this new environment, the security necessary for his life. The solution to these problems is taking shape as a result of scientific progress outside of all social preoccupation. After generations, science, in its quest for truth, is forced to discover new forms of energy in the world and great organic chemical syntheses. This scientific movement can be accelerated by creating new methods of research. It can't be stopped, because there is not a force in the world which can shackle human understanding in its march once it has understood, as in the present case, the scope of the truths which are open before it. What would be the significance of the synthetic production of nutriments to human life and to the life of the biosphere? By its accomplishment, man would free himself from living matter. From a social heterotrophic being, he would become an autotroph. The repercussions of this phenomenon within the biosphere would be immense. It would signify the schism of the block of life, the creation of a third branch independent of living matter. By this feat, there would appear on the terrestrial surface, and for the first time in geological history of the globe, an autotrophic animal. By this achievement, human understanding would produce not only a great social effect, but a great geological phenomenon. Indeed, man's path is always formed in great part by man himself. The creation of a new autotrophic being will give him possibilities which have been lacking for the accomplishment of his secular moral aspirations. It will open for him the path to a better life. The process of cephalization has led to human reason and the noosphere. So, talking before about trying to develop higher hypotheses, can we get at what is the principle which underlies cephalization? What's really going on? And my answer to this is the concept of energy flux density. So, for those who are unaware, energy flux density is a fairly simple concept to understand. So, energy flux is just the energy flowing through a two-dimensional plane. So, it's illustrated here in the concept of energy from a light source. And if you move a two-dimensional plane close to the light source, the spot that the light shines on gets smaller and smaller and brighter. That's because the amount of light flux is concentrated in a small area. And so the energy flux density is very high. And conversely, when you move that two-dimensional plane away from the light source, the spot of light expands. And so the same amount of energy is concentrated in a larger area. And so the energy flux density decreases. So the evolution of life is one of increasing complexity and organization and increasing energy flux density. For example, moving from reptiles to mammals, mammals have a much higher rate of metabolic activity. So the energy density within mammals is much higher than reptiles. And this allows them to exist in colder climates, in rougher climates that reptiles cannot live in. And it allows them to develop larger brains and have increased brain activity or increased cephalization. And cephalization is an increase in energy flux density because the functions of the brain consume energy. And so an increase in cephalization in an organism necessarily increases the energy flux density in the anterior portion of the body. And it increases the proportion related to the total amount consumed by the body and decreases the proportion consumed by the posterior. In human society, we see processes like city building as an increase of energy flux density. So energy flux density in human society, cities are a great example of cephalization or of increasing energy flux density. And you can see that from some of these maps. For example, here comparing North Korea to South Korea, and you can just see the immense increase in energy flux density in the cities of South Korea versus hardly any in North Korea, and the lack of development they've had. Cities are cephalization. You have networks that extend out from the center, that serve the center and go out into the sparser periphery. And this is a universal principle throughout history. Going back to the development of agriculture, agriculture led to a surplus in production, which allowed for an increase in our population and allowed for increasing population density in cities. And you need only look at the development of cities in Mesopotamia or in the Nile River Valley in Egypt. So that physical increase of mankind, it was a qualitative shift in our ability to produce food. And it led to the first cities and the development of cephalization. And so we can then ask the question, are cities a good thing? Is a characteristic of healthy human evolution the development of cities? Is urbanization a positive trend? And I would argue yes. As energy flux density increases, the productive powers of labor increase, and one farmer can do the work of 10 farmers, and then of 100 farmers. And so as less and less farmers are needed, with industrial development increasing, you have an increased development of labor, and you have more jobs which are created outside of the farmland areas for people to pursue. So in other words, the the productive powers of labor were more and more concentrated in the mechanized labor on the farms, or specifically in the heat engines of the mechanized labor. And in history, material human progress has always happened due to this increase in the energy flux density in society. This is not a new thought. We can read here from Alexander Hamilton in his report on manufacturers. He says, to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of the expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. Even things in themselves not positively advantageous sometimes become so by their tendency to provoke exertion. Every new scene which is open to the busy nature of man to rouse and exert itself is the addition of a new energy to the general stock of effort. And he goes on to say, in the course of the preceding illustrations, the products of equal quantities of the labor of the farmer and the artificer, which is his way of saying manufacturer or industrialist, the artificer, have been treated as if equal to each other. But this is not to be understood as intending to assert any such precise equality. It is merely a manner of expression adopted for the sake of simplicity and perspicuity. Whether the value of the produce of the labor of the farmer be somewhat more or less than that of the artificer is not material to the main scope of the argument, which hitherto has aimed only at showing that the one, as well as the other, occasions a positive augmentation of the total produce and revenue of that society. It is now proper to proceed a step further and to enumerate the principal circumstances from which it may be inferred that manufacturing establishments not only occasion a positive augmentation of the produce and revenue of that society, but that they contribute essentially to rendering them greater than they could possibly be without such establishments. These circumstances are, number one, the division of labor. Number two, an extension of the use of machinery. Number three, additional employment to classes of the community not ordinarily engaged in the business. Number four, the promoting of emigration from foreign countries. 5, the furnishing of greater scope for the diversity of talents and dispositions which discriminate men from each other. Number 6, the affording a more ample and various field for enterprise. Number 7, the creating in some instances a new and securing in all a more certain and steady demand for the surplus produce of the soil. Each of these circumstances has a considerable influence upon the total mass of industrious effort in a community. Together, they add to it a degree of energy and effect which are not easily conceived. Some comments upon each of them, in the order in which they have been stated, may serve to explain their importance. And he goes on to that to expand on each of those 7 points, and it's well worth reading. I won't go into all of that here, but he does go on to say, and from these causes united, the mere separation of the occupation of the cultivator from that of the artificer has the effect of augmenting the productive powers of labor, and with them the total mass of the produce or revenue of a country. In this single view of the subject, therefore, the utility of artificers or manufacturers towards promoting an increase of productive industry is apparent. So, what are some more examples of increasing energy flux density in human society? So one thing we can talk about is power lines, electrical power. So the introduction of electricity, you introduce new energy flows in the forms of electrical energy flowing through human society, which previously never existed. So you're adding a whole new form of energy to human society. And you can see here map of the United States transmission grid to just show exactly how much this of this exists just in the United States, but of course it exists all over the world. But adding these increase the energy flux density of human society. Similarly, transportation infrastructure, which Hamilton called the greatest of all improvements, and I'm going to get into that in the next part of this series, of why transportation is the greatest of all improvements. But transportation increases the both the speed and the number of vehicles, whether it's horse-driven or internal combustion engine-driven. And that increases the energy flux density through society. You're increasing the energy because each vehicle is using energy in order to move. The same thing with other forms of transportation, like freight trains or more recently, maglev trains. You are increasing the energy flux density in society because the amount of energy flowing through that society necessarily is increased. The same thing goes with something like water distribution systems. The energy involved in pumping that water to distribute it to homes is energy that previously wasn't there in society. And so the energy flux in society is increased no matter which square kilometer of land that you're looking at. So here we distinguish a very useful principle. So all energy can be used to accomplish work. So for example, the gasoline that's in a car that you use to get you somewhere, you could just pour that gasoline on the ground and light it on fire, and it would still accomplish work. And technically, you would be increasing the energy flux density in society. But really, is it anything that you care about? No. The only energy flux density we're concerned with in society is the energy that is used to accomplish useful work for a human society. We can talk a little bit about energy sources. This is a cartoon from XKCD, or I can't remember what it's called, but it's a famous online cartoon where they're trying to show the differences in energy density of various fuels, and just the manifest leap that it is going from fossil fuels to nuclear energy. So here we can see coal. So from wood to coal, we first moved from wood to bituminous coal from about 18 megajoules per kilogram to 24. And then from coal, we moved to gasoline and diesel fuel. We moved from 33 to 45, 46 area. So moving from 18 to 24 was the first industrial revolution in the mid 1800s. Just that tiny increase in energy density of our fuel sources. And then moving from anthracite coal, which became the dominant form of coal at the end of the 19th century, from 33 to 46 of gasoline or 54 in natural gas. That is the accomplishments of the last 100 years. Of everything that has changed is due to just moving from 33 to like 46. And then if you look up here, you see the amount in fissioning of uranium-235, you go from 46 to 77 million. So what would be the implications for human society if we move to a fully nuclear society? Like, the implications of moving to a nuclear society have not yet been realized for humanity, not in the slightest. So just to give one example, this is a typical 120-ton aluminum boxcar, carries coal. So we can easily calculate how much energy is contained in one of these train cars. Approximately 3.5 million megajoules of energy. That's equal to 73 tons of natural gas, 27 tons of liquid hydrogen, or 47 grams of uranium-235. So the same amount of energy, you go from 120 tons of anthracite coal to 47 grams of uranium-235. And this necessarily leads to an increase in the productive powers of labor, because either way that you look at it, if you move 120 tons of uranium-235, you have millions and millions of times more energy in that fuel to use. So by doing the same amount of labor, you're transporting vastly increased amounts of energy. And conversely, if you want the same amount of energy, you need to move 120, you need to move 47 grams instead of 120 tons. So you can see that the productive powers of labor here, it's very easy to understand how they're improved just by increasing the energy density of your fuel sources. And so the last idea I want to talk about is potential relative population density. And here we have to give credit to Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, because, I mean, let's be honest, all of these ideas, I think most of us were introduced to them by Mr. LaRouche, and his organization did pioneering work on all of this, on cephalization, energy flux density, all of this, 40 years ago. But in particular, potential relative population density is an idea that LaRouche himself is responsible for. It's a very profound idea. And so we have to give credit where credit is due here. The term may sound difficult, but it is not very difficult to understand. So we'll start with population density. Everybody knows what population density is. It's just given a square kilometer or square mile or whatever it is of land, how many people do you have living there? Now, moving to relative population density. This is recognition that not all land can support the same population. So, for example, if you have, very rocky soil versus very fertile black soil, the amount of people that can be supported on a square kilometer of that fertile soil is much higher than people who can be supported by low quality rocky soils, for example. Similarly, in a mountain area, you can support much less life than, let's say, in a fertile river valley. So you need to understand the relative population densities based upon the type of land that you're looking at. And then finally, we add the word potential relative population density to it to understand not just how much of population density a given area of land can support, but what is the potential population density that it could support given our current level of technology. For example, take a look at California's Imperial Valley. You can see this helicopter image here. It's some of the most productive farmland in the world, surrounded by arid desert, unable to produce anything. And so if we look at relative population density, you would say that the Imperial Valley of California can support very, very few lives, very small population density. But the potential relative population density of the Imperial Valley is much higher, because given our level of technological progress, we are able, through irrigation, to bring water and to bring nutrients to irrigate the land and increase the amount of food that we can grow on it exponentially. So this is very nicely illustrated in a scene from 1932, which is a documentary that actually Matt first introduced me to. Fantastic documentary, where they demonstrate this principle quite nicely.
Hey, Sam, is there sound?
Yeah, there is. Can you not hear it?
No.
Okay, well,
but it's visually explanatory.
It's classical music, yeah. So what we saw there was the development of transportation networks, meaning rail networks, and the explosion in population density, which accompanied those rail developments. And in the next part of this series, I'm going to go further into that in the development of rails in the Northeast and of the Erie Canal, and how these are development corridors that population density explodes along them. They're centers for growth. But just looking at the Transcontinental Railroad, what what exactly did we do in the when we built the Transcontinental Railroad? Was it just simply laying down some iron rail for trains to, go from New York to San Francisco? That's not what it was at all. The development of the Transcontinental Railroad was a qualitative upshift in the economy of the United States as a whole. For example, before the Transcontinental Railroad was built, the trip from New York City to San Francisco was a minimum of 6 weeks, because you had to sail from New York City down to Panama, lift your boat over the Isthmus of Panama, then put it back down in the Pacific, and then sail back up the coast to San Francisco. So if you encountered bad weather, it might take you longer than 6 weeks. When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, that length of time to travel went from 6 weeks to 9 days. And it became highly regular, highly dependable. So it's not just a quantitative increase going from 6 weeks to 9 days, but it's a qualitative increase as well, because it's of a much higher quality of transportation than travel by boat, which was much more unreliable. And the result of this was not just that people could get to San Francisco faster. Like, entire new industries became possible that were not possible before, just from the ability to transport across the country by rail and not have to depend on the inefficient boat traffic anymore. This is the essence of human economy. This is the essence of increasing in complexity through science and technology, increasing cephalization, increasing energy flux density, and potential relative population density. And notice that this is expressly anti-Malthusian. This clear directionality, it runs against everything that Malthus said about his notions of depleting fixed resources and rising human populations being a bad thing. All of human progress in known history has been anti-Malthusian in nature. And since we talked about Silliman before, I just want to give an example of Silliman and his work developing the American oil industry, because it really was an example of all three of these ideas. The development of the oil industry increased the productive powers of labor because of the increased energy density of the fuel source. And so because of that, the energy flux density of society as a whole was increased, because the amount of energy flowing through society was now increased. And the ability to support more of a human population led to the increase of the potential relative population density. And so this is why LaRouche himself called economics a science, not the dismal science, but the greatest of all human sciences, he considered it. And I definitely agree with him. So in conclusion of this part one, we'll ask the question again: are humans the most precious of all creatures? I would say that humanity is special in that we alone have the power to see the potential future in the present and to change the present to evolve into that future. And so we should ask the question, what must the world look like in 50 years? And what must we begin to do now to get us there? And notice, this is a power no other animal has. And I want to ask the question, what is the higher hypothesis which unites the concepts of energy flux density, the productive powers of labor, and potential relative population density in the spirit of Parmenides? My argument would be it's the principle of least action, which was developed by Leibniz. Because for all of these things, we want to accomplish them most efficiently with the least amount of action. And this is the principle which underlies the increases in energy flux density, in the productive powers of labor, and in potential relative population density, getting more done with less energy. So to conclude, what is the directionality of human progress? Human society must be anti-entropic. And by that we mean that we need we don't just mean that we want the potential relative population density to be increasing over time, here signified by calculus in Leibniz notation. We don't just want potential relative population to be increasing with changes in time. We want that rate of change itself to be increasing. So the rate of change of the potential relative population density needs to be increasing all the time for society to be anti-entropic. So in other words, if you measure 2 years ago, the rate of increase of the potential relative population density of society, and then you measure it the next year, that rate of increase should be higher than the rate of increase that it was the year before. And that would signify an anti-entropic human society. We want to see policies that increase the productive powers of labor, and we want to see policies that increase the energy flux density of society. And we see a similar directionality in the evolution of life, in the evolution of the universe, and in the evolution of human civilization, which is that human progress, just like the evolution of life and of the universe, can only run in one direction. Otherwise, human society will collapse. And I have this really nice quote from LaRouche where he says,
Oh, no, we can't hear that.
yeah, I figured. But it's what it says on this screen anyway. So it's one of my favorite quotes from LaRouche. Without endless technological progress, society is doomed sooner or later.
Matt,
And so I'll just say quickly for part 2, this is a quote from Socrates. The secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new. I was actually really disappointed to find out this is not a quote from Socrates, because I love this quote. It's actually from a movie where the character's name was Socrates, but I still think it's a great quote, and it really is true. And so in part 2, we want to talk about what are the policies that we need to fight for going forward, because it's not just enough to be anti-Malthusian. We need to have policies to inspire people that we need to put forward.